I think that he is, in a very gentle way, a kind of a maverick. He's never been particularly concerned about either going with the flow of what's currently fashionable or going against the flow. It's not particularly an issue to him if he's in fashion or not. I would say that of the major Australian figures of the mid-20th century, and mid and sort of like into the second half, Butterley is probably the most widely read in terms of knowledge of other music. It's not to say that Sculthorpe and Meal and the others were not aware of other music, but I think that they focused their attention on things that spoke personally to them, where Nigel, because of his activities as a performer, also his activities as a broadcaster, I might add, because he worked at the ABC for a long time and presented programs on the whole range of contemporary music. I think that was another thing actually that I discovered in the course of the research for the book that I hadn't quite expected, that there were particular pieces where it was very clear, okay, this is Butterley exploring ideas from Berg, this is Butterley exploring ideas from Messiaen, this is Butterley exploring ideas from Tippett. And while I think his general musical enthusiasm, particularly for those last two, Messiaen and Tippett, is actually something that's sort of fairly well known and that he's often sort of expressed, to be able to actually point that out in particular pieces was quite interesting. And so I think that does flow out of his experience as a performer. We think of Nigel as being a very intuitive composer, and I think in his more recent work, the work for which he's best known, and when I say more recent, I really mean since about the mid-1970s, so all but some of his very earliest work, he is mostly intuitive. But there's a small period where he was actually doing quite strict serial 12-tone writing, including one piece where I actually discovered traces of integral serialism, which is the compositional method of the 1950s that only really was in vogue for like a few years, where composers took the principle of writing with note rows and extended it to as many other dimensions of the music that they could think of, so that there were not only note rows for the pitches, but also equivalent rows for like the lengths of notes or how loud they were and so on. And I discovered some rhythmic series in a couple of early Butterley pieces. So far as I'm aware, there are no other Australian examples of integral serialism, and if you'd been asked to guess who was the sole integral serial Australian composer, you probably wouldn't guess Nigel Butterley. I think that the understatement in Butterley's work is a common factor for a lot of his work. There are a few places a few pieces which are sort of exceptions to that rule, I guess. But that does show up in some of the very earliest pieces as well as the more recent ones. I think one thing that's characterised Butterley's work that's a bit different, for example, to both Sculthorpe and Meal and to a number of other composers of their generational close. Ross Edwards is another that come to mind. All of those three figures, Sculthorpe, Meal and Edwards, started out writing quite uncompromisingly modernist music, and at different points and in different ways turned their back on that and said, no, I'm not having a bar of that. That's not the real me. The real me is something much more expressive, much more traditional in certain ways, much more expressive. For Butterley, that shift does exist, but it's a lot gentler. There doesn't feel the really sort of drastic parting with what he'd been doing earlier in his career. All of the things that he'd explored in his modernist period are still there in the later music, just maybe with slightly gentler edges. A lot of his works are religious in nature and inspiration. In the early years of his career, he was a practicing Anglican, and the works are quite directly Christian in their inspiration. But even even in those early works, if I think of In the Head, the Fire, for example, which is based on texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, he's by no means restricting himself to an Anglican or even a Christian sense of spirituality. Later in his life, he moved away from organised religion he was no longer a practicing Christian, but I think that spiritual orientation remained incredibly important to him, the transcendent element. In Spell of Creation, he explicitly put alongside one another religious texts from different traditions. So Christian texts, although not biblical texts, texts by Christian mystics, alongside texts from ancient religious traditions, the Book of Baal, for example, some ancient Hindu texts as well. And you could say also that the poetry that he's drawn to, Kathleen Raine, Walt Whitman, even Emily Dickinson, I don't think any of those three poets you would describe as conventionally religious in terms of their subject matter, but transcendence they have in spades. They're all about reaching beyond the here and now and into the things that lie beyond what we can perceive sort of in everyday reality, the beautiful sort of extraordinary other world that exists behind and alongside reality.